Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. We are very pleased to have one of our very own growers and RegenWA steering committee members, Nick Kelly, with us today. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are all zooming from today across Western Australia, Australia and the world, and pay our respects to the cultural elders of the past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their spiritual connection to country. Today, as I sit here listening to the rain on the roof, I'm sitting on Whadjuk land, where it is a season of muckaroo. This season saw the coming of the first rains and allowed free movement across the land to hunt for red meat animals for food and clothing to help ward off the cold. RegenWA believes in regenerating our regional landscapes and communities. We focus on supporting farmers who are investigating alternative production practices with the aim of minimising or reversing the impact of productivity constraints like climate change and soil acidity. With the interruption to our farmer field days, we have turned to providing these webinars, which provide an opportunity to hear from other like-minded farmers and practitioners about how and why we can transition to more regenerative farming practices. This is our first webinar with a local WA farmer, with more to come. If you want to catch up on all of our webinars so far, visit our website. In a fortnight's time, we will have Kent Broad with us, and he'll give us a bit of a one-on-one on carbon. Details for this are also up on the website. Before we begin, a quick outline of how the webinar will work. As you will notice, everyone is on mute, which is great for reducing background noise. So can you please keep yourself on mute? Also, if you could turn off your videos, this will reduce the bandwidth for those in the regions and for those in the city with average NBN. Now for questions, please pop them into the chat box. I will then ask these to Nick as we go through. So on to Nick and his family. So Nick Kelly manages Holland Track Farms, and he's a leader in demonstrating regenerative agriculture on his Newdigate property. He and his family have created a farming system which is sequestering carbon, reducing erosion, enhancing soil health and increasing moisture retention, all without chemical use. He joins us for our fourth RegenWA webinar to give us an insight into how he manages his farm in a way which is regenerating its natural resources while remaining commercially competitive. Now I'll hand over to Nick to get us started, and don't forget to ask your questions as we go along.
Welcome everybody. There's a bit of rain falling on our roof as well at the moment. If I do start breaking up, Shay, just let me know, because I can hear the hub over there whirring and clanging. I think it's only just holding together. I'd just like to give everyone who's joined us a little bit of an intro and some background into what we've been doing and where we are, and a bit of the process that brought us to where we are now. So we were, I know some of you will know this information, but so I'll just give you a really brief kind of summary. We were prime lamb producers, very much year in, year out cropping livestock enterprise. The farm was established in 1965, and about 20 years ago, we sold all of the livestock, and we were early adopters of the knife point movement. We went to total cropping, higher fertilizer, and chemical use. And it didn't take us long to run into a few issues, especially on our shallower, gravelly soil types without a lot of resilience. Most of the issues that we saw were weed issues, and I was spending a lot of time on the boom spray, which I think is quite normal for that kind of system anyway. But I've actually got better things to do than spend all of my time spraying, especially spraying repeat offenders that just weren't seem to be getting any better. So I started to investigate another way of farming, and trying to find out if we could do things differently. I didn't realise that the issues we were facing back then were soil health related issues. So around the late 90s, early 2000s, I was inspired by some really inspirational speakers. Some of them brought to WA by WANTFA, WA No-Till Farmers Association. the likes of Rick Bieber. We came across Dr. Christine Jones. And there was a whole host of, Rolf Derpsch actually was another one that bought over from Paraguay. So some of these guys were the original zero-till cover crop specialists. And we set about trying to learn how to implement some of this on our own farm. And that brought us up until, or just fast track now, up until 2014. We went cold turkey on our synthetic fertilizer. So we just literally turned off the tap, and we replaced our fertilizer inputs with a compost extract, with biological stimulants like fish kelp, humates, fulvic acid, and we use Nutrisoil occasionally as well. I should add that in 2010 we went to a zero tillage system. So we went away from any form of tillage at all, from knife points to a single disc opener. Since 2014 and going away from those synthetic fertilizer inputs, we also started really pulling back on our chemical use. So we went after the soil treatments first, so the pre-emergent herbicides, the bare earth treatments, we eliminated those. We pretty much eliminated the non-selective herbicides like the paraquat, gramoxone, and glyphosate, and we'd reduced it pretty much to selective herbicides. So just in-crop sprays selecting specific weeds. Now, just before I go any further, I just wanted to talk about the 5 soil care principles that we adhere to, just so that you can see our system through the lens that I see it through. So these are the 5 soil care principles that are certainly out there now, and you can research these for yourself. But these are the 5 soil care principles that we implement on our farm, and these are derived or are found in nature. So if you climb over the fence wherever you're farming, wherever you are in the world, even though climate changes, rainfall changes, these principles still apply. It doesn't matter where you farm. You'll find these living plants in the soil all year round. Zero tillage, soil cover, plant species diversity, and timed or holistic grazing of animals. Shay, would you mind popping up the first photo? I'd just like to just bring you up to speed with what it looks like on our property this year. And this was taken a few weeks ago now. This is a cereal rye crop which has been planted into a bit of a sporadic perennial pasture. You can see some perennial grasses in the foreground there and some chicory in the background. And there's also some native or some summer annuals still in there. There's also a multi-species of winter annuals in here as well. There's field peas and there's lupins. There's flax or linseed in there as well. And this is quite typical of our single species. So our target here is still cereal rye. That's what we will harvest. And we're trying to get as much diversity in this system as we can. You'll notice that the what looks like stubble in this photo, the grass from last year sticking up in the rows, is actually a ryegrass stubble. It's not a cereal at all. Well, it is a cereal to a degree, but it's not something that we planted. And interestingly, this paddock is still quite clean in this photo. There will be grass that comes later as it gets wetter and colder, but by then our plants will be well and truly dominating the environment. So this is quite a good situation. I should add, as Shay goes to the next slide, that 2 years ago we found ourselves in a position where we weren't using any chemical at all, and we weren't using any synthetic fertilizer at all. And we hadn't intended on being organic growers, but we found ourselves there by default, and it made good sense from a marketing aspect to certify organic. So we're in our second year of organic certification. Thanks, Shay. Go to the next slide. Great. This is I just wanted to demonstrate the difference between sowing a crop into a perennial stand as opposed to sowing crop into annual grasses or into an annual based system. This was some contract sowing I did for a guy who's about 70 kilometres south of where we farm. This particular farm hadn't been cropped for at least 12 years, and it had quite a lot of grazing pressure, not necessarily holistic grazing or timed management, but just set stocking, roaming across this farm of about 4,000 acres over the last 12 years. And the things that we saw surviving were the blue bush, which is obvious in this picture, and there was quite a lot of native perennials as well. You can see a little bit of the osteostiper that's been chewed down to ground level. But the rest of the things that were surviving, and that it's not so evident in this picture, but in other areas, were the plants that were able to survive prostrate on the ground. So geranium, a little bit of winter grass. There wasn't a whole lot else there, so it lacked a bit of diversity. But after some discussion, the guy that owned this property was keen just to plant his crop down in that perennial stand with very little soil disturbance, and it resulted in a really good strike. This is oats that we've sown here, and we'll watch this with real interest. But you can see the lack of real crop competition from the winter annuals. And Shay, you can go to that next slide. This is one of our own crops, and this was just taken the other day. This is a wheat crop. There are no perennials in this paddock, so it's very much still in an annual system, and we're moving away from that as fast as we can. We can't get perennials into the system fast enough. And you can see there's quite a population of ryegrass in between the crop rows. Thankfully, we've got our crop reasonably well established in this scenario, and from experience, we'll still harvest a reasonable amount of wheat off this paddock. It will still be certainly be viable. We can go into cost of production and economics a bit later on if people are interested. Thanks, Shay. Next slide. Here's another one there. Quite good establishment. But still quite a lot of ryegrass in that picture. I'll come back to that. Yeah, thanks, Shay. This is a very similar scenario. We'll jump to the cow. So this is really foundational as well to the system that we're in. The integration of livestock. These are being managed by a guy named Tom within our enterprise, and he's working 2 jobs at the moment. Normally these would be fenced with a single hot. Well, they are under that management now, but their field is a little bit lower at the moment because he's time poor. But generally these would be in quite a small paddock and moved rapidly. Thanks, Shay. This is just set up very simply with a water truck that can be moved and a mobile trough, and you can see the hot wire there. Thanks, Shay. He just uses tread-ins with a single hot wire, and you can see there is a crop it's a multi-species cover crop that's being established underneath what the cattle are grazing there. So later in the year, this will be a grain and graze, or grain or graze, I should say graze or grain scenario. So there's potential to harvest that multi-species crop, or to harvest it with a machine or with animals. Either way, this is a barley crop, and this is a paddock that had a huge turnip population last year. It wasn't in crop, although it was grazed, and this year we're seeing quite a big influx of capeweed in this particular paddock. Again, we've got our crop relatively well established, and it's got some good root mass on it already. Just a picture of some linseed down in that crop. All of our multi-species, all of our single species cash crops still have companions of linseed, or a clover, a gland clover, or a rose clover. So everything has a companion of some description. Thanks, Shay. And I should mention that what we've done with our crop varieties is we've gone back and sourced varieties from 50s and 60s that seem to grow and perform better under these conditions. We've tried the newer varieties. It's really evident with the modern wheat varieties. They just don't stand up well in this environment, whereas the older ones do really well. So it appears to me that we're still going through that weed succession in that annual system, seeing weeds replaced with different weeds each year. So it's something in our system that we just have to work with. You can also see in that previous slide that there's also a bit of insect pressure in there, which is gone now, and the new leaves aren't being attacked. You can just see some of the older leaves were being chewed, probably by redleg, and probably harboured by those broadleaf weeds as well. Thanks, Shay. This slide and the next one, thanks, Shay, just give you a bit of an indication of the root mass and what's going on underneath the ground. I've got tiny little plants with quite large roots on them. I dug them up with my fingers, and I was leaving some root mass behind. Unfortunately, next time I'll do it with a shovel, but it does show you that we are setting these plants up, or they're setting themselves up below ground quite well, and foraging for nutrients, and that's something we'll discuss today as well. Just for interest's sake, this was in the paddock next door while I was fossicking around. I don't know much about dung beetles, but their activity is evident. So I had a hunt around in this cow pat and found this cute little guy. Thanks, Shay. So this is on our property still, and I just found this really interesting because we are heading towards that perennial pasture-based system. And what I should mention before I go any further is last year, nearly all of our cash crops were sown into a perennial pasture base. Most of them exotics like lucerne and chicory, panic grass, Rhodes grass, and Soteria and the like. And this year we're out of that phase, unfortunately. So a lot of our annual crops are being planted into an annual system. But here's some native plants that are just really kind of dominating some of the environment. And I often wondered if these were our friends or not. But you can see the wheat crop doing quite well in this ground cover, which is I don't know much about this one. It's a creeping ground cover you often see on heavier country and on dam banks and things like that. Thanks, Shay. A similar scenario here. You can see the weed burden is reduced because of that ground cover and the dominance of that native ground cover, and the crop doing very well down in there. And with a zero tillage system, we can just slice straight through that cover and establish a crop relatively well. Thanks, Shay. Bit more of the same. There's a little bit of blue bush in here. Having this ongoing discussion with Tom, who manages the livestock, as to what's going to happen with this blue bush, which is the bigger salt bush in the background, whether we need to manage that or remove it. He's very much a livestock guy, so he's really seeing the benefit of having that diversity within the system. And just after doing that cropping project, the contract cropping, it's quite obvious that can be beneficial if it's managed well. Thanks, Shay. This is a picture of a multi-species cover crop, which is sown down into a perennial pasture-based system. So you can see in the foreground there's some panic grass, or it might be Rhodes grass. There's panic grass just in the middle ground, and there's plenty of lucerne in this paddock as well. This was just planted for grazing last year, and it's the same again this year. So this will be harvested, but with animals, and you can see there's some winter type canola sown into this mix as well. So we're getting the brassica back into the mix. Some of these mixes are up to nine different species. This is this slide here. There was a question someone asked about have we been able to observe how valuable or effective the vermicast foliar treatments have been. This is a barley crop here, and this is I'm pretty sure this is where I changed the pump, or my father and I changed the pump on the liquid cart, so there was a bit of foliar, liquid spray that was being applied down the tube at sowing. It was just spilled on the ground here, and so you can actually see. I don't know what the rate is. It'd be nice to know, but there's quite a difference in crop growth where we've got a higher rate of that compost extract and nutrisoil on the ground there. And interestingly, there's also less weed pressure. Those conditions are more favourable to the crop than to the weeds. So you certainly do notice the impact of these foliars, especially where the rate is higher. We're not leaving areas out to see if there is a difference. There's no quick fix in this system. I believe it's all about the numbers. It's about numbers of biology. So year on year, we're just adding more biology and more diversity to the system. Thanks, Shay. So I wanted to bring you back to a perennial pasture base. This was in crop last year, this paddock, and I haven't cropped this paddock this year. In future, as our livestock numbers increase, we'll go back to more of multi-species cover cropping the whole farm for grazing and for holistic management. But this just gives a really good illustration, and it's a generalisation, but it's a really good one. Where we have a perennial pasture base, and this is lucerne and chicory, Rhodes grass and panic grass predominantly, we just see huge areas where there are no weeds, where the environment is being completely dominated by this perennial pasture base. And from experience from last year and previous years, our annual crop grows very nicely in amongst these perennials. So from my point of view, this is just an absolute no-brainer when it comes to zero-till regenerative organic growing. Obviously, you wouldn't want to plough this, you wouldn't want to rip this up to establish a crop. But with a zero-tillage system, there's just no need to, and we can establish quite a good crop in this scenario. And not to mention the ground cover and the grazing that you get. This was taken yesterday or the day before. So, and this lucerne has behaved almost as if there was no drought. We had no summer rainfall at all. It was virtually zero. So you can see how resilient this perennial pasture system can be, especially when you're integrating livestock into this system. Thanks, Shay. Back to an annual environment, and this is an oat crop. So you can see again here, there's quite a lot of weed pressure. From a conventional lens or a chemical farming lens, I understand this would horrify people, and I'm under no illusions about weeds. But from experience, I also know that we will get a profitable crop out of this environment because our cost of production is so low, and we also have the capacity to graze this as well. So we can harvest it. We can harvest it either way. Thanks, Shay. There was also a question that came through about how do we make and apply our compost extract. Here's a picture of our particular compost extractor, and they come in all shapes and sizes. We designed most of the features about this one. That's an 8,000 litre tank, and it's got an agitator inside, which forces material downwards. And you can just make the outline of the baffles inside. You can see the black plastic baffles that stop that whirlpool motion, so you get a rolling motion. We add around 100 kilograms or less of a good quality compost into the hopper at the top, into that 8,000 litres, and that's agitated for at least half an hour, and we give it around half an hour to settle out. And then you can see the filtration system there on the left-hand side. There's just 2 rows of filters. They're the same filters in series, going from very coarse to fine. I've taken 1 filter out, so there's only actually 3 in there now. And that filtration system, or the coarse or fineness of those filters, is really determined by what you want to do or what you want to put that compost through, how you want to apply it, whether it's a boom spray or it's a liquid injection system. And it also has a false sloping floor on the inside, which heads towards an 18-inch outlet on the other side for flushing it out. And there's a few modifications that we plan on making to this just to make it easier to clean out. But these can be modified to scale or made to scale. So you could make bigger ones or smaller ones depending on your cropping program or your pasture program, the size of your enterprise. But it's a really good system, and it's quite efficient and works quite well. There was you can see the outlet there on the left-hand side, which just drains into a sump, and the electric motor for the agitator on top. There was another question that came through, and it's a really good one. It says, what would be the first priorities I would implement when first transitioning from a conventional grain production system to a regenerative farming system? And it's a great question. I would incorporate animals. I would make sure there were animals in the system. In this kind of transition, we're coming at this from kind of it's a bit back the front for us, because we've been so focused on grain growing for so long that the animals are coming. They're coming last, but they are coming. The animals are here, and there are more coming. So I would get animals into the system as soon as I could. The second thing that I would do in a transition is I would start reducing chemical or synthetic fertilizer inputs while starting to use compost extracts and biostimulants, and I would decrease my synthetic fertilizer input around by thirds, or maybe less, just depending on how it's going. It's something that can be monitored. and I wouldn't go cold turkey like we did. If you don't need to, I wouldn't just turn the tap off. There are ramifications for doing that. The third thing that I would recommend is going after the nastier chemicals. So going after the pre-emergent herbicides and the herbicides that we know that are doing damage to the system, particularly to our biology. So they are the first three things that I go after.
There's a couple of questions that have come through, Nick. So one of them was, do you dry seed to allow the crops to get a head start on the plants?
Yep, that's a really good question. And in a system like that, like our system, that's vital. So we've mucked around with sowing times, and we need to go early. You can go too early, but what we generally try to do is start with the multi-species cover crops for grazing as early as for us around the middle of March, and then at some point switch over to cash crops. If you get a huge rainfall event while it's still warm, it's not the end of the world. You don't generally tend to see the winter annuals that compete with your crop don't come to the fore until the temperature starts to drop. So you certainly want your crop hopefully established, if you can get it, before it starts to get cold. So yeah, that's certainly really important. And dry sowing is quite often the case in our system because we're going that early. This year we had some earlier rainfall events, and I was a bit behind the eight ball in getting all of our winter cash crops in, hence quite a bit of weed competition early. But that's certainly something that's really important.
Another question was, how often do you use compost extracts?
So we use a compost extract at between 70 and 80 litres per hectare at sowing, and that's down the tube, right on top of the seed. And this year we used a litre of Nutrisoil as well with that compost extract. And then we use a foliar spray, which I'm gearing up to do very, very soon, and that'll be compost extract with probably a litre of fish hydrolysate, and I'll also put in some kelp, some fulvic acid, and some humates as well. Very small amounts, but they're all biostimulants and plant growth stimulants as well. So I'll throw those in there. But that'll be a foliar spray of about 50 litres per hectare. So that will happen at around the 3 to 4 leaf stage, which is quite important as well for when your plants are determining and setting up for yield quite early on.
There's some photos here. Do you want us to bring up there's a question that says, are you making your own compost and vermicast?
Yep.
Do you want me to bring those photos up?
Yeah, that'd be great. And while you're doing that, there's been a lot of questions around phosphate fertilizer in a system like ours, and we haven't applied any P for 6 years now, and DPIRD have been doing some soil mapping across the farm just in the last few months, and I've just been looking at these maps, and I've still got to get more information around these results, but just at a glance, if we're looking at phosphorus status assessed at 95% of maximum production, and this is for pasture, we are still high. So this is after 6 years of no applied P. We are still high. And if we look at a phosphorus environmental risk index, which says there's enough there to be a risk of that P being lost to the environment, we are still extreme. So it shows you that there's a lot of discussion needed around what's happening in our soils and nutrients, whether they hang around, whether we can access them biology, and I've got a lot of questions myself around that, but it's just fascinating data. So Shay's just throwing up a couple of pictures of compost. This is our old fertilizer shed, and this is now where we keep our compost. There's just a picture there of there's some irrigation running through the roof, so we can just keep that moist if we need to. Some compost is delivered or has different moisture content, but you don't want it to dry right out. And we experiment a little with what we were spraying on there, and we did put a little bit of fish in there, and some humate, some fulvic acid, and some kelp, and the conditions were right for fungi, and that pile turned white in about 24 hours. And I'd let a few hundred compost worms into that pile, and then they just came and pulled all of that fungi back down into the pile. So it was just a way of value adding to a really good product.
With your compost, and like your vermicast and stuff, has it been a real trial and error thing? Because I feel like, isn't there like getting that right mix?
What I do know is that if you, you can put compost and vermicast, you can put it under a microscope. You can analyze it for nutrients if you want to. When it comes to vermicast products, and compost as well, I'm not sure in our broadacre systems, when we're just talking kind of litres per hectare, I don't think you can overdo it. So just looking at those results, where we had some spillages on the ground, we're getting quite amazing results from plant growth. I don't know what the limitations are, but again, I don't think there's any quick fix when it comes to vermicompost and vermicast products. I think it's about getting the biology stimulated, and just getting the numbers of diversity back into the system. And I think part of our problem in our kind of chemical ag systems or chemical farming systems, we've really been driving that diversity of biology down, and we've been using a lot of fungicides, and a lot of our chemical inputs are fungicide by chemical nature. So I think we've been driving our systems very bacterially. So just getting that balance back, I think, is really important. So that might determine what sort of compost you apply and where you source it from as well, whether it's very fungal or bacterial. What we do is we change composts, we change compost suppliers to make sure we get diversity in the system.
Yeah. Nick, someone sent through a question that says, last week soil aeration prior to transitioning to using liquid extracts, etc., was talked about as important. How does this fit with zero till?
I think one of the benefits of having perennials in the system, at least a living root all year round, you've got a far better chance of having an environment for biology, to support your biology and to keep it alive, as opposed to a bare soil with nothing growing, and especially a soil that's prone to wind erosion. I think it's very, very difficult to establish biology and good numbers and diversity of biology in that environment where it's susceptible to blowing, where you don't have living plants. That's why I see, and it brings me back to part of what we're doing here on Holland's Track Farm is really trying to sequester carbon and grow carbon and increase that organic carbon, not just in the top soil profile, but right through the profile with deep-rooted perennial plants. And I've come to the conclusion on our farm anyway that in a reductionist chemical farming system, we couldn't increase soil carbon. We just couldn't. We couldn't move it. We're always removing we're always replacing what was there with our monoculture crops. And I've seen some organic soil organic matter test come back recently. That's a discussion for another time, but I'm just not seeing that move fast enough. So I think in our soils and in our environment, if we're really serious about growing soil organic carbon, which I think is the kicker for production, for whether it's for livestock, whether it's grain production, it's going to come back to how much carbon you've sequestered. I think that perennial pasture system is how we're going to find those gains over the short term and long term as well.
Was there other slides that you wanted me to go through? Because there was some with your hands, like with a cup of seeds, and there was so much diversity in there.
Yeah, let's have a look at those, Shay. And there was also a question about chemical drenches on cattle. No, since the cattle have come onto the property, we haven't used any drenches at all. That question would be better put to Tom, but we do know that there are other ways of dealing with things like parasites and worms, in animals. We know that pumpkins, for example, are a really good wormer. So there are other ways of worming animals. We just haven't seen an issue. My understanding is that if animals are really healthy and they have a diverse diet, then you're probably unlikely to have real issues with with worms and parasites in your animals. But I'm certainly no expert on that. Shay's just throwing up a photo here of this would be a summer cover crop mix here. So there's some mung beans in there. There's some sunflowers, some sorghum Sudan. There's buckwheat in there. There's white French millet. So when there is summer rainfall or a really wet spring, this is a really good way of firing up biology quite quickly. In our environment, you could be disappointed if we didn't get much spring rainfall or any summer rainfall. The years that I was really going after these mixes, we had some really great success, and we did pick up some summer rainfall and some thunderstorms. So we're really glad we went after these. We grew a lot of white French millet as well. Shay, you might be able to find some of those pictures of the white French millet. I think it was early on in the slide with an enormous plant. There's an example there of a winter cover crop mix as well. Lupins and field peas and vetch and barley and oats, cereal rye. See, there's a little bit of wheat in there as well. So all of these can be used far easier in winter, of course, to really fire up biology and get that diversity of plants back into the system. Great for grazing, and get that diversity of biology as well, which is associated with each different plant. And when it comes to livestock, having that diversity just makes them far healthier. None of us like living on lettuce. So yeah, that was it. Thanks, Shay. There's some pictures there of white French millet. That would probably be around February or March there. So you can see that in our environment, provided you have some summer rainfall, you can grow enormous biomass with plants like white French millet. This particular one here doesn't have a huge amount of diversity in it because it is a cash crop, and we harvested that. But there's another one there, Shay, I think, where it zeroes in a little bit on the root mass as well. Yeah, there it is there. But just an enormous amount of biomass, and we can change our systems quite quickly. We'll change our soil quite quickly, implementing plants like this. And it's great to see there's more and more of this kind of thing happening in the wheat belt. It's really exciting to see. Were there any more questions coming
I
through?
thought this one was really interesting, this picture here that you have up.
Yep.
And yeah, so what do you do with this? Why have you planted this?
So this is a tillage radish plant, and it was sown as part of a multi-species cover crop. It was a slightly dry year, that one, but it just shows you that we do have really serious compaction issues in our wheat belt soils, because this plant has literally just gone sideways. In fact, it's almost grown back out of the ground again. So we've got a lot of work to do, and I think that's where the deep-rooted perennials are going to really fast-track this if we want to avoid tillage, deep ripping, and soil amelioration with cold steel. We can use deep-rooted perennial plants to do it. So I get this is just really showing what that compaction layer looks like and how hard it is. We had a couple from NRM, Wheat Belt NRM, taking some deep soil samples during the week, and they got to about 60 centimeters in our soil and broke their gear. So it just shows how hard it is down there. There is certainly some compaction, and some of that may have been a compaction layer or a hard pan that has been there for a long time. But we certainly have compacted the that top 60 centimeters with continuous traffic and tillage, of course, making our soils anaerobic and more prone to compaction as well.
So in your no-till systems, is using these tillage radishes one way of bringing that aeration into the soil?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about plant diversity, throwing things like the tillage radishes, and there's you could use radishes from the hardware store as well. Getting that diversity into the system, and plants that have massive roots and that open and aerate the soil. Really good way of changing our soils relatively quickly. But again, you don't necessarily want just a tillage radish or just a brassica in your system either. It's really good to have that diversity. It's really interesting to see in our environment here, if we grow a monoculture of legumes, we start changing that carbon to nitrogen balance, and then we quite often see a wild swing to a grass infestation following that. And one of the ways we're getting away from that, while still wanting to grow legumes, is just to select a grass like barley, for example, and just grow them together, and then we stop that wild swing of carbon to nitrogen, and we can easily separate a barley seed and a lupin seed or a field pea seed. Lupins have no mycorrhizal association either, so not ideal to grow as a monoculture anyway. So we can get across that by throwing species together and mixing it up and then separating seeds. A bit of thought and planning needs to go into that, but it's not that hard when you think about it, and we've been doing that successfully for some time.
So soil acidity is obviously an issue. How do you deal with it on farm?
We still, I was just talking about these soil nutrient maps that I was referencing before with our pea, and I'm looking at areas where we still do have some very low soil acidity, down to around as low as 4.4. So there's still some issues. The chemical farmer in me just wants to tear out with lime and change that quickly. But one of the things that we do know about the deep-rooted perennials is those perennials and the associated biology will actually change pH around the rhizosphere. as they grow, and from month to month, season to season, they will actually manipulate that biology. So I'm still growing what I would call in our system pretty successful crops despite the acidity. So I'm pretty comfortable just to leave it at the moment, and we'll test it again. We'll just monitor it and we'll see if it changes. A lot of the farm is getting into the low to marginal now, and I know that it was pretty consistently acidic before. So interesting to know how much it's actually changing over time. But yeah, so that's how I'm managing it. Basically, I've taken my hands off and I'm letting the biology do the job there as well.
It's all about building that diversity, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
There was a question that was sent through prior, which I don't think I sent on to you. So there's a question about applying biocontrol agents for controlling pests and diseases. Is this considered part of a regen ag practice?
I would say it certainly would be if you're dependent on a specific crop yield and you're watching your crop be decimated. Regenerative farmers are still using I'd like to think herbicides in a wise fashion, where we've chosen not to use any. So I don't I'm not chasing insects. But what I would say is that as soon as we went to a diverse cropping system, the insects, they didn't go away, but we allowed the predators to come to return and the predators to deal with the situation. So, for example, we would never have grown field peas as a monoculture. They would have just been decimated by insects. Also, canola. I would never have. I've never considered growing canola as a monoculture in a chemical system without an insecticide. Soon as we throw in diversity, you saw some pictures of canola in that multi-species cover crop. I see a few leaves being chewed, but it's just really not an issue. We've got field peas with barley this year. It's just not an issue anymore. I'm not suggesting that it will never be an issue, but I think we get to the situation where we have a system that's resilient enough to recover. There was a bit of weed pressure on that barley. You could see the yellow tips where it had been chewed, probably by redlegs. And it's just not something I would chase. It just recovers. So, yeah, as far as what people can do when it comes to insects in their cropping systems, well, I would say I'd point them to diversity firstly. After that, sure, if you have to protect your crop for your income and your livelihood, absolutely.
Was there any other pictures or slides that you wanted me to bring up before we ask for the final questions?
No, I didn't have any in mind. If you wanted to flick through any, Shay, that might trigger some questions, that's fine. I don't mind. There were no specific ones.
Cool. There was just one question that's sent through, and then I'll flick through some of the slides as well. It says, I would love to hear more about how the financial side compares to how you used to do it. And also, do you find a regenerative system less labour or time intensive?
I'll address the labour and time. I think that all comes back to systems. So when you have really good systems in place, I think we have more time for doing soil care things. So rather than spending all of my time on a boom spray now, hopefully I've got more time for shifting animals and for stacking enterprises and other animal enterprises. I will be spraying, but my spraying will probably take me a week, and that will just be foliar spray. So it's not a big burden these days, and I feel a lot better about spraying good things than spraying poison. The economic the economic question, that's a really good one. One of the reasons we do this, and one of the reasons that that we're part of the Wheat Belt Integrity Group. If anyone wants to check that out, it's really about economics. It's really about freeing the wheat belt from the slavery of debt. So getting out of that cycle of overdraft and term debt, where you're constantly farming for the bank, farming for big chemical, big fertilizer. So from an economic viewpoint, I think this kind of system is just so exciting, especially when we consider having more enterprises on a smaller area that are really that are viable, and incorporating more labour. Suddenly we have communities with more people in them. So the more people that get a handle on this, we're going to regenerate and revive our regional areas and our country towns as well. So that inspires me to a great degree. Our cost of production, just to throw a few numbers around, looking at around the $5 per hectare for our fertiliser program. So that includes the Nutrisoil and the compost extract, and the other bits and pieces, the fulvic and the fish and the humates and kelp that we throw in there. And that can be adjusted up or down in any given year, depending on cash flow. And then I was just throwing some figures around yesterday or the day before around fuel. We're pulling a single disc opener, so it's a 40-foot machine, doesn't take much pulling. So I think we're down around that kind of $5 per hectare for fuel. Keeping in mind fuel's pretty cheap at the moment, so we're up around that $10 per hectare. The currency of business is relationships, and that's one of the upsides of being a regenerative zero-till organic grower, is we're just forming relationships all the time with people who are interested in food, but also customers, people that are becoming customers. So people with regenerative and organic, free range, pastured pork, poultry. There's lots of different enterprises, and we're entering the cover crop market as well. So when you're looking at the other side of it, we don't sell any grain for less than $500 a tonne. We're very much out of the old system, and we are becoming price setters. So from that economic viewpoint, it's it is really exciting from a financial viewpoint as well. It's nice to to spend your own money on your enterprise, and to not have overdrafts and big term debts and all of that kind of thing. So I hope that answers that question to a degree.
Someone just asked to put up some photos of the filter system, so I think this is the one they were after.
Yep. This is just off the shelf banjo filter housings, just all coupled together. And you can imagine the filters in those are quite large, and none of this is overly expensive kind of gear. And the reason there's two rows of filters is so that if I ever have to clean a row of filters on the run, I never have to turn off the flow of compost entirely. I can just isolate one row. I can clean one while it's still flowing out. I'd normally clean them all together when the tank was empty, but I have that the capacity to do that. Also for volume as well, we just get a bit more volume through there with 2 rows of filters. But we normally would get 16,000 litres plus. We might even get 3 or 4 tank fulls of compost through those filters before we have to clean them. So it's pretty low maintenance, and they're super easy to clean as well.
Thanks, Nick. I think there's no more questions that are coming through at this stage. With that, I think we'll just finish up. Nick, I'd like to thank you. Today has been really good, and I think it's been really insightful. I really did get excited looking at the photos that you'd sent through this morning. I think what you've captured in those photos really represents what some regenerative agricultural principles are, which are often hard to capture in a photo. I can't wait to eventually, hopefully one day, get out to your place. Maybe this year's wig field day will be my day.
Thanks very much. And thanks everyone for listening, and all those that attended. It's been a real privilege to share what we're doing on Holland's Track Farm.
Thanks, Nick. So with that, I'll close off the webinar for today. So like the other webinars, this one we made available online via our website, so keep an eye out for that one. And yeah, like I said again, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and Nick especially. We'll also be looking for regen farmers if they want to come on and do similar to what Nick's just done and sort of give us a bit of a photo slideshow about what they do on their property, because that's what RegenWA is really aiming to do, about bringing people together and learning from farmers and farmer to farmer learning. So if you're interested, let us know, and I'll be happy to set one of these up, or maybe even get out to your place to have a look around as well. So enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we all get some more rain. So yeah, thanks again, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Thanks, Shay.